right, so we're going to record here the arm. The arm is actually deceptively complicated, so I want to spend some time looking at the arm, and especially at this articulation here, wherein the bones of the arm are able to, so cool, able to pivot on each other. No, this isn't a pivot, this is a flexion and an extension. However, there is also a pivot possible, which is this. This is literally called a supination. Okay, so when we look at an articulated skeleton, it's very important that we keep everything in anatomical position. So anatomical position, Rebecca, would you please show us the anatomical position? One of the important aspects of this is that her palms are facing forward. So that if your palm is facing forward, what this means is that and you can do this yourself at home, your thumb is lateral. Make sure you prove it to yourself. The thumb is lateral. This is super important. The radius, which is this bone right here. So there's three bones we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at the humerus, which is your upper arm bone, and then your two lower arm bones are the ulna and the radius. Now the radius is going to be on the thumb side. So as long as you're in anatomical position, the radius will be on the thumb side or on the lateral side. However, you can also, of course, pronate your arm so that the thumb is medial. And in this case, what happens is these two bones cross each other, and the radius is now rather medial. So be careful that we're always representing this in anatomical position unless you are otherwise told so. Okay, so let's take a look, first of all, at the humerus, I think. We'll start with the humerus, and I want to differentiate the humerus. Again, we have our bones laid out here in the way that they would be articulated with each other, which is helpful. But I also think it might be helpful just for a moment to bring down the femur. Oftentimes students will mistake the femur for the humerus, and I think it's because there's a head there that's kind of distinctive. So if a student was simply looking at this bone, they might automatically say, oh, it's the femur. Just be careful. The femur has a much longer neck, for example. And it's much larger, although, you know, in a testing situation, you wouldn't have the comparison. It would just be its bone by itself. So be careful of that. All right, so we're going to start off with the easy stuff. Up at the proximal end, you'll have the head of the radius. And it's a good point to say that the head is facing medially. It's facing inward. The head of the humerus articulates with the glenoid fossa of the scapula. And it articulates, it doesn't sit in there real nice. When you look at the femur and the acetabulum, the articulation is very tight, and it's unusual for the hip bones to be dislocated. But in fact, the head of the humerus is dislocated fairly regularly. You've certainly known people that this happened to, because they do not articulate perfectly together. I mean, well, this isn't articulating at all, but because the glenoid fossa, or the glenoid process, is so shallow, it's such a shallow fossa, the head doesn't fit super nice in there. So there is the head of the humerus, and again, that is facing medially. It would articulate with the acetabulum. With the glenoid fossa, I beg your pardon. Articulate with the glenoid fossa. Okay. Now, next to the head, we have two very distinctive structures. These are called tubercles. There's the greater tubercle and the lesser tubercle. Now, the greater tubercle is slightly larger and slightly above, and the lesser tubercle is slightly smaller and slightly below. You might mix up the tubercles with the trochanters of the femur. Just remember that these are, there's the greater and lesser trochanter in the femur as well. Just remember these are smaller bones, and the word is smaller. Tubercle is a smaller word than trochanter. All right, on sort of the lateral edge of the humerus, we have the deltoid tuberosity. So this is an attachment point for a very large muscle called the deltoid muscle, and it's kind of subtle, but it's a rough structure in there. All right, there are two necks. There's an anatomical neck and a surgical neck. So the anatomical neck is very close to the head. The surgical neck is a common breaking point, a common place where, I don't know if it's common, but oftentimes if there's a break in the humerus, it will be the surgical neck. All right, so now we move on to where these three bones are articulating with each other, and specifically, Rebecca has hooked a bone called the ulna around the humerus. Be careful with the spelling of humerus, by the way. There's no O. I will mark it wrong if there's an O in there. Humerus with an O is a different word. All right, so there's 3 different structures in here that are named very similarly, and I must admit this is, for me in anatomy, this was probably the hardest thing to remember because, I don't know, they're just named similarly. All right, so we're going to start off with the posterior structure. Now, when you look at, so when you look at the posterior side of the humerus, it's going to have this divot that's actually very, very distinct and like very deep. On the anterior side, there also is a fossa there, but it's much more subtle. So the posterior side, we're going to have this structure called the, oh my gosh, I want to see the capitulum. It's not the capitulum. It's the olecranon fossa. The olecranon fossa of the humerus receives the olecranon, very good, the olecranon of the ulna. The olecranon fossa of the humerus receives the olecranon of the ulna. The next structure we'll take a look at is the trochlea and the trochlear notch. So the trochlea is going to be a structure of the, and this is so hard to see in pictures, you really just have to get your hands on this one. This entire thing here is the trochlea. It actually swings from back to front. It's sort of like a door hinge, I guess. And what it receives is the trochlear notch of the ulna. So the trochlea of the humerus receives the trochlear notch of the ulna. So the ulna is this distinctive C-shaped bone, and that C shape is the trochlea. The last of the structures we'll look at is the capitulum. We're not going to look at the capitulum. We're just going to look at the olecranon fossa. Oh, the coronoid fossa and the coronoid. Okay, so the coronoid fossa is the anterior structure. Remember I said there was one part of the ulna that's more subtle, and then it receives the coronoid process of the ulna. So get to know the 3 structures of the ulna and the 3 structures of the humerus, and get to know how they fit together as well. I mean, you kind of have to learn those 3 structures together. Now, if you look at this in an articulated skeleton, you can see clearly the structures here. And that is the point of your elbow right there. The trochlea of the ulna is the point of your elbow that you're always bumping on things. All right, the last of the ulna of the radius, the last of the bones of the last of the structures on the humerus would be the lateral and medial epicondyles. So remember that I said that the head is going to be medial. So if you follow the head all the way down to the other end, that would be your medial epicondyle, would be right in that region there. And then the other side would be the lateral epicondyle. All right. The next structures, and the very last ones we're going to be covering. The ulna, there's only one. There's 2 more things I want to cover on the ulna. Okay, so the ulna has a radial notch. If you look at this C shape, you'll also see a little notch right there that fits the head of the humerus, the head of the radius perfectly. The head itself. Yep.
It's been a long day.
Yeah, I know, yeah. So then you go down to the bottom part here.
They just don't stay together.
You're going to see 2 styloid processes. You're going to see one styloid process on the ulna, the tip there, and you're going to see one styloid process on the radius. Now remember, so there's a styloid process that is lateral and there's a styloid process that is medial. Just remember that the ulna is always going to be the medial bone and the radius is always going to be the lateral bone because we do assume anatomical position. So those are the styloid processes. And yes, here we have the head of the radius, very distinctive looking bone. And one more structure on the radius, I think this is our very last one, will be that radial tuberosity. It's an attachment point for muscles that we're going to be discussing down the line.